Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event and to make introductions. I'm Sarah Abrevaya Stein, and I am the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the L&D Leve Center for Jewish Studies and the Viterbi Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies, as well as a professor of history here, and delighted to have you here. And on behalf of the center, I want to welcome everyone. And welcome our Etta and Milton Leve Scholar in Residence for the year, Dr. Annette Yoshiko Reed, who has been referred to by my colleagues as the superstar of her area, and we will take that. We'll take that welcoming remark. I have a rather long list of homage that I want to pay before actually introducing Professor Reed, because this visit has been eagerly anticipated by many units on campus who have also lent their support. So I want to extend thanks to the UCLA Center for the Study of Religion, UCLA Department of History, Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, Department of Classics, as well as the Jewish Studies program at Loyola Marymount University. In the back of the room, you'll see some information about some upcoming events, our final events of the quarter. And you will also find some representatives of the Leve Center staff who are always working hard behind the scenes to make every event come off so beautifully, so I thank all of them. Today, Dr. Reed will be speaking on the topic of lost books, the forgetfulness of writing and the forgetting of Jewish pasts. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about her and the larger project from which I assume this talk derives. So Dr. Reed joined Harvard's Divinity School faculty in July 22, making a move still in the tail end of pandemic, which must have been horrific, having previously taught and distinguished herself as a scholar at New York University in the Scribalism Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and McMaster University as well. Her research, and here we get to the superstar status, spans Second Temple Judaism, early Christianity, Jewish-Christian relations in late antiquity, with a special concern for bringing ancient examples to bear on the theorization of identity and difference. Professor Reed's books are a long and impressive list and include Fallen Angels and the History of Judaism and Christianity, Jewish Christianity and the History of Judaism, and Demons, Angels, and Writing in Ancient Judaism. And she has also co-authored and co-edited multiple volumes, including The Ways That Never Parted with Adam Becker, Jews and Christians in the Roman Empire with Natalie Dorman, Enoch from Antiquity to the Middle Ages with John Reeves, and Rediscovering Enoch, the Antediluvian Past in the 15th and 19th century. Throughout this work, she has consistently considered and reconsidered the intertwined histories of Jews and Christians through the lens of marginalized writing. As for today's presentation, I will quickly summarize from the blurb that she has offered us to note that the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has often been noted to have transformed understandings of ancient Judaism, expanding radically our evidence for Jews and Judaism prior to the rise of Christianity. Yet, as Dr. Reed writes, this material also stands as a striking reminder of how much of the literary heritage of Jewish antiquity has been lost, how and why this material was lost to the Jewish tradition, and what might its forgetting tell us about Jewish memory making, past and present, are the questions at the heart of tonight's lecture, explored with a focus on lost books, real and imagined, and the shifting meanings of writing within Jewish cultural history. So we are delighted, Dr. Reed, to welcome you to campus, and I turn the podium to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to the Leve Center for sponsoring this, and actually all the co-sponsors who I won't repeat again, but not for lack of gratitude. It's been a wonderful visit so far, and I really enjoyed both being on campus and having time to meet graduate students, meet with faculty, catch up with people, and so forth. It's been this great delight, and it's a special delight to me too because of the fact that I'm using this as an opportunity to try out new ideas. So forewarning in advance, but even so far, it's been incredibly productive. So I'm very deeply, deeply grateful. If people learn this, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. So states Plato, famously in the Phaedrus, writing about writing. The context is Socrates' retelling of an Egyptian tale about the very origins of writing, as among the civilizational arts revealed by the god Thoth to an Egyptian king. Thoth there elevates the art of writing as a medicine for memory and wisdom, a divine gift that will make the Egyptians wiser and improve their memory. The king, however, is not convinced. If people learn this, the king protests, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. Due to their trust in writing, they will no longer remember with themselves, by themselves, but from the outside by means of external marks. What you've discovered is a medicine not for memory, but for reminder. Today, centuries after the invention of the printing press, from the other side of the conceptual canyon that is the Gutenberg divide, it has come to seem natural that acts of writing are acts of memory. Modernity sides with Thoth against the king. For us today, the trustworthiness of documentation always trumps speech. We're suspicious of hearsay. We question gossip. We want receipts. We habitually presume that the textualization of knowledge must always and everywhere preserve for posterity. And to be sure, our association of writing with fixity has precedence in antiquity as well. In the very first line of the very first book of what's commonly hailed as the very first work of history, at least in the West, Herodotus frames his own literary acts in precisely these terms. This is the publication of the Historia of Herodotus Halicarnassus, so that what has been done by humankind does not, with time, become forgotten. But there is reason to wonder whether Herodotus there expresses more hope than certainty. What we know about books and writing in antiquity, after all, bespeaks a situation in which textualization actually did not assure continued preservation. Ink fades, insects nest in manuscripts. Papyrus and parchment were precarious, but they were also precious, and thus older manuscripts were frequently scraped and scrapped for materials to make new ones. And even from those celebrated eras of Greek and Latin literary production that are commonly elevated as classical, there is far, far more that is lost than survives. Today, in the heft of our modern print books, words can be rendered identically across large quantities, fixed in form, mechanically multiplied in stable singularity, diffusing a danger of loss. The contrast with pre-modern manuscript cultures is thus quite stark. In a world remade by copy machines and computers, ebooks, and iPhones, it can be easy thus to forget that the very survival of literature in antiquity was predicated on the continued mediation of scribes engaged in transgenerational acts of copying and recopying, copying and recopying. Herodotus may place his hopes in writing as ensuring a remembrance that will not fade into forgetting, but the material facts of pre-modern literary production make poignant instead Plato's counter-reminder of the precariousness of memory, even and perhaps especially when deposited in books. In my time here today, I'd like to reflect upon a parallel tension within ancient Judaism, which we are now able to reconstruct precisely because of ancient books that were long lost to memory but later rediscovered. That is, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Rediscovered beginning in the middle of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls include fragments of approximately 900 manuscripts, mostly in Hebrew and Aramaic, dating from between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. That is, from the later end of what scholars commonly call the Second Temple period. These manuscripts include the very earliest copies of almost all of the books now in the Hebrew Bible, but they also include a massive expansion of our other literary evidence for Second Temple Judaism, revolutionizing our understanding of a period of Jewish history that had previously been poorly attested and therefore treated as if transitional, largely dismissed as post-exilic, pre-rabbinic, pre-Christian, and largely deemed significant, often just for the background of the origins of Christianity rather than for the history of Jews and Judaism. For decades now, specialists in Second Temple Judaism have worked laboriously to reconstruct the previously unknown and partially known text from the Dead Sea Scrolls, while also considering what all this newly recovered evidence might allow us to restore of the history, lives, and literature of Jews in the Second Temple period, living under Hellenistic, Hasmonean, and early Roman rule in the land of Israel. But precisely because of these laborious efforts and their success, we can now ask other questions too, including just how all this was actually forgotten in the first place. How, by whom, and to what cultural effects. Even prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars knew that some works of Second Temple Judaism, especially in Greek, seem to have been abandoned by later Jews, but transmitted instead by Christians, at least at some point after the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Most famous in this regard are the writings of Philo and Josephus in Greek, but we might also cite the Old Testament Apocrypha, works like 1 and 2 Maccabees and Tobit, Old Testament pseudepigrapha, works like 1 Enoch and Jubilees and 4 Ezra, the Septuagint, Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, and Jewish authors like Demetrius, Artopanos, Ezekiel the tragedian, Philo the epic poet, and others. Nevertheless, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls yielded far more besides. And as such, this massive manuscript find stands as a rather shocking reminder of the sheer quantity of the literary heritage of ancient Judaism that seems to have been lost to later Jews, not just in Greek from the diaspora, but also in Hebrew and Aramaic and from the land of Israel. How could this happen? After all, the Jewish people are often hailed as a people of remembrance par excellence. So how could we have lost so many books and forgotten so much, including the very fact of its forgetting? These are among the questions that I'm exploring in my current in-progress book project, which focuses on the forgetting in this Jewish reception of the Second Temple past and experiments with using this example as a crucible for theorizing the cultural power of forgetting more broadly. For all the recent theoretical attention to memory, commemoration, and remembrance, including but not only an interdisciplinary field of memory studies, there's been a common tendency to ignore forgetting, or perhaps more accurately, to dismiss the phenomenon of forgetting as simply a failure to remember, and thus not in need of any analytical attention. And even more so, since, as Bradford Vivian recently notes, there's been a moralization of memory in modern times. Ours is a culture, Vivian notes, that typically treats memory as a rich and vibrant means of preserving the past, and forgetting as a form of commemorative passivity or neglect, a symptom of the undesirable dissolution of communal heritage or historical wisdom. And hence, both in the popular imagination and in academic fields, even in memory studies, examples of forgetting tend to be dismissed as, in his words, ethical failings, whereas imperatives to archive, document, and preserve hold a moral higher ground. Recent studies on the neurology and psychology of individual memory, however, caution against a dismissal of forgetting as only neglect or failure. Like pruning a plant or weeding a garden, forgetting is natural and necessary for the functioning of the human mind. Neurologists like Blake Richards and Paul Franklin thus stress that the importance of forgetting is as a critical component of a healthy mnemonic system on the level of the individual. So too, sociologists of knowledge like Eviatar Zerubbabel have shown it's actually impossible to understand what's remembered of the past within families, groups, and other collectives if we don't also understand what's forgotten and relegated to forgetting, attending thus to omissions that necessarily accompany any act of selectivity, silences that punctuate the rhythms of remembered time, erasures that make space for new narratives, new stories about the past to be rewritten, overwritten, retold in ways that speak to a changing present. In my current book project, I'm asking whether a similar approach might possibly enrich our understanding of Jewish histories and reception histories as well. I do so with an eye to key moments in the remaking of the memory of the ancient Jewish past, already in the Jewish past, with a focus on what's omitted and how, what's sidelined and dropped out as a result. After all, as much as we can tell the story of modern Jews and Jewry as a tale about the persistence of memory as survival, in resistance to trauma and other assimilation as challenges of forgetfulness, it remains that our modern sense of ancient Judaism has unfolded throughout the recent centuries as a series of reminders of just how much we've actually forgotten. In the past, about the past, recovered and rediscovered as shards and fragments in the present. Part of what is useful, thus, about this particular example is the opportunity to explore dynamics of cultural forgetting that aren't just limited to a wholly passive extreme of failure or loss on the one hand, or an active extreme of authoritarian suppression on the other. Rather, what I suggest is we can use this example to explore some of the variegated dynamics and phenomena in between, charting the aggregation of a set of microdynamics of cultural loss, resultant, for instance, from pedagogical and liturgical acts of pruning and partitioning time into usable pasts, narrative acts of reframing and overriding texts, figures, and events, festal acts of collapsing and compressing remembered time and temporality, and archival acts that collect and collectivize selective pieces of the past, newly projected as if the whole. I could not be more delighted to be here this week and have the opportunity to share some of my in-progress findings in the project so far, and also try out some ideas I'm now in the midst of working out. On Tuesday, I talked a bit about history and the temporalizing amnesias of periodization, and in my time with you here tonight, I'd like to reflect on the rather paradoxical sets of forgetting associated with writing. To do so, I will look back to a couple key moments within shifting perspectives on lost books, writing, and the forgetfulness of writing within ancient Judaism, including some that have most shaped our own memory of ancient Judaism, but also those that have been most forgotten as a result. Today, the Torah, in the sense of the 5 books of Moses or the Pentateuch, exemplifies scripture and the textualized tradition that Jews preserve from forgetting. In the Torah itself, however, the act of writing does not even warrant a mention until well into Exodus. And the first time that it does appear is in the context of forgetting. In Exodus 7:14, God commands Moses to write this in a book as a reminder, but the reminder does not pertain to any Jewish heritage or ancestral tradition per se, or even any teaching. Rather, concerns utterly blotting out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. Later in Exodus, of course, references to writing become far more prominent, including divine acts of covenantal writing, as well as Moses' transcription of divine words. But even there, we don't quite find a trust of writing as writing in our modern sense of that term. Even in Moses' near-death arrangements for the writing of his teachings, that is, his Torah, into a book at the end of Deuteronomy, what's stressed instead is a need for public reading and practiced remembrance to activate the efficacy of the written word. The physical scroll is less memory, in other words, than reminder. That writing does not suffice, moreover, is assumed throughout much of the rest of the Hebrew Bible as well. Even texts that are clearly deemed important are described as having been lost or destroyed, precisely because of the physical precarity of a written word. Exodus 32 tells of 2 tablets inscribed by God himself. Both are shattered. Jeremiah 36 refers to a scroll in which the scribe Baruch transcribed the prophecies of Jeremiah. It is cut up and burnt. Even more striking is 2 Kings 22. This chapter famously recounts how a scroll of the Torah of Moses was rediscovered in the reign of Josiah by a priest who so happened upon a copy in the temple archives during renovations. And it's often interpreted as perhaps an origin tale from some form of Deuteronomy, or otherwise deduced as early evidence for the Pentateuch as we now know it. Read on its own terms, however, it is hardly a story celebrating the power of textualization to preserve. Whatever is meant here, the point is that it was effectively lost to collective memory, resulting in Israel's forgetting of the covenant. 2 Kings 22 thus points to what our modern assumptions about books can sometimes lead us to miss about biblical ideas about textuality. They're largely predicated on an ideal of reading that is not silent, private, and seen, but rather voiced and heard. Within the Torah and most biblical literature, the materiality that really matters is not a physical book. What matters is a voice that speaks, the ear that hears, the mind that remembers, the body that acts. And thus the textualization of wisdom can ironically multiply the risk of its loss, precisely by virtue of disembodying teachings from teachers. As for Plato's Egyptian king, the deposit of remembrance in writing comes coupled with the danger of loss, precisely because a book is less memory than reminder. But of course, we can read about this today because it was written down. And this points to some of what the Torah and much of the Hebrew Bible also relegates to forgetfulness, even in its own remembrance of Israel's past. There clearly must have been scribes who wrote down and copied all these texts, and biblical texts contain numerous internal markers of the sorts of redactional, editorial, and anthological work, as well as literary forms known to have been central to the agency and activity of communities of scribes elsewhere in the Near East. If we look closely, we can see their fingerprints, as Bill Schneidevin has richly shown. Yet, in the Hebrew Bible, as Bernie Levinson observes, there is not a single text, legal or otherwise, definitively attributed to an actual scribe responsible for composition. Scribal agency is largely effaced. This, however, is what changes, and quite dramatically, in Jewish literature from after the Babylonian exile, and especially later in the Second Temple period. Beginning already with works of late biblical prophecy like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, we do begin to see a newly self-conscious literary representation of books and writing begin to emerge, concurrent with far more explicit attention to roles of scribes in transmission of traditions, especially prophecies. This attention, of course, first comes with a bit of skepticism, as most famous from Jeremiah's lament about the lying pens of scribes. But part of what the Dead Sea Scrolls has enabled us to recover is a scribal perspective, or at least a perspective from some learned Jews who recast the Jewish memory-making and transmission with an eye to the agency of scribes, asserting the importance of scribal pedagogy, scribal literacy, and books for protecting the past against forgetting. When local landscapes of memory become leveled by invading empires, who keeps tradition from oblivion? When temples are reduced to ashes, are scrolls stored therein simply lost beyond all recovery? What happens when whole peoples are dispersed? Who stands between ancestral wisdom and the forgetfulness of time? Given the events that began the Second Temple period, from the Babylonian exile to the spread of the Achaemenid Empire to the conquests of Alexander and the advent of new Hellenistic empires like the Ptolemies and Seleucids, reshaping both Greekness and the Near East, it's perhaps not surprising that some Jews during these centuries reflected on such questions anew. And this is part of what we're now able to recover in much more detail, thanks to new evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Particularly useful in this regard is the evidence of Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls. Whereas many of the Hebrew Dead Sea Scrolls that are best known from that corpus reflect a sectarian ideology of some community or communities, perhaps associated with a settlement near Qumran or references to the Essenes, the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls predate any such community and preserve a pre-sectarian and presumably non-sectarian perspective onto Judaism in the 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE. That is, in the wake of the conquest of Alexander, when the land of Israel first came under the rule of the Ptolemies, a Hellenistic empire that patronized Greek knowledge and was centered in Egypt. In my last book, I discussed the ramifications of the evidence of the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls for recovering some forgotten elements of Judaism from the 3rd and early 2nd centuries BCE, such as demonology and astronomy. For the book I'm working on now, however, this material also proves useful for another reason. The Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls are marked by a sharpened sense of the power of writing, which parallels the rise and prestige of books that we also see across the rest of the Hellenistic Near East during these same centuries. This development, of course, is most famous from the Library of Alexandria and the bookishness of the imperial culture politics of the early Ptolemies that it represents. And Jews living under the Ptolemies were clearly aware of this, because in fact, our very earliest evidence for the Library of Alexandria is none other than a Jewish text. Written in Greek in Alexandria in the 2nd century BCE, the letter of Aristeas tells of the Jewish translation of the Torah into Greek, that is the Septuagint, in Egypt, precisely in the context of the Ptolemaic imperial aim to have a great library collecting all the books in the world. What we see in the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls is a parallel concern among Jews writing in Aramaic, whereby Israel's past becomes retrospectively recast as a history of scribes, books, and writing, an ancestral library, starting long before Moses, but also ensuring a continuous transmission of knowledge to Moses as well. The Torah, for instance, tells us very little about Moses' father, but the visions of Amram, now known from the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, claims to be nothing other than a copy, an exact copy of the writings of the words of the visions of Amram, son of Kahat, son of Levi, that he revealed to his sons and what he advised them on the day of his death. And the rest of the visions of Amram consist of a first-person account that makes references also to Amram's other writings, including when he wakes up from a dream and carefully transcribes it. The visions of Amram, in effect, make a claim to be a book written by none other than Moses' father, who is in the process recast as a scribe. A related source from the Dead Sea Scrolls, also in Aramaic, makes a similar claim for Amram's father, Kahat. In the admonitions of Kahat, also written in the first person, Kahat commands his sons to take care of the inheritance which your fathers gave you, which include truth, justice, and the priesthood, but also all my writings as witness that you should take care of them. In the Aramaic Levi document, we find yet another link in the same chain. Here, Kahat's father Levi is made to stress as well that he learned reading and writing and teachings of wisdom, and that his sons will inherit them. And when Levi writes of what he himself learned from his forefathers, it includes what Abraham commanded me from what he had discovered in the book of Noah. In turn, Levi commands my sons to transmit reading and writing and the teaching of wisdom to your children as well. It is scribal literacy, in other words, that here serves to vouchsafe an unbroken line of transmission of ancestral wisdom from Noah to Abraham to Levi and thus to Kahat. In the Torah, the time between Levi and Moses is cast as a period of rupture and forgetfulness, the period that sees the enslavement of Abraham's progeny in Egypt and the rise of a new Pharaoh who did not know the name of Joseph. In these Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, however, there is no such forgetting. The reader is assured that all along, books were passed from father to son, together with the scribal skills needed to read them, make new copies, and add new teachings along the way. Both books and literacy become central as an inheritance passed from Abraham through the generations leading to Moses within these Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls. From the Torah, one would never know how Moses even learned to write, and one might even infer some connection to his upbringing in Egypt. In the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, however, Moses is thus provided with a Jewish lineage of literate learning, together with an ancestral library inured against forgetting by a scribal heritage. Scholars have long noted the bookishness of Jewish apocalypses and other so-called pseudepigrapha from this same time, and the evidence of these Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls thus serves to fill in our sense of what's at stake. The Jewish apocalyptic literature surrounding Enoch, for instance, was long known in Christian transmitted translations, such as the late antique Ethiopian compendium 1 Enoch. But with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we now also have fragments of the Aramaic originals, but also a richer sense of their ancient Jewish context in Aramaic Jewish literary production. When we read these in light of the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, we thus see the choice to write in the name of a figure like Enoch is not just a choice such as we might think in modern terms as forgery. Rather, it is a claim about the power of writing to resist even the rupture of the flood, vouchsafing the knowledge that Enoch, as a scribe of righteousness, as he's called here, is said to have learned from the very angels and from heavenly books, transmitted thus in his own books and writings to his son Methuselah. So too with Jubilees, which is long known in Ethiopian translation as well, but can now be read in Hebrew fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. Writing in the name of Moses, Jubilees traces a line of scribes from Enoch to Levi, stressing as well that what Levi inherited at the death of Jacob was no less than a Jewish ancestral library, with the aim, moreover, for Levi himself to preserve and renew them for his sons until this day. The claims made in Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls and the Aramaic Enoch literature are thus made even more explicit in Jubilees. What protects the Jewish past from forgetfulness is a scribal stewardship of books. At first sight, this largely forgotten Jewish corpus might seem to exemplify the power of a trust in writing, akin to what we often take for granted today. But there's perhaps one important sense, I'd suggest, in which they are no less shaped by the pre-modern sense of the precariousness of writing that we noted at the outset in conversation with Plato and 2 Kings. Hellenistic-era Jewish books like 1 Enoch, Aramaic Levi, Admonitions of Kahat, Visions of Amram, and Jubilees all ground their plausibility in the presumption that you could have a hitherto completely unknown book written by Enoch or Levi or Kahat or Amram or even Moses that could surface suddenly in Second Temple times. Their very writings about writing and their writings about the power of writing to preserve the past are thus grounded in the lived reality of textuality prior to the printing press, the experience of the loss and forgetting and sometimes refinding of books. In the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls and Jubilees, however, the implication is rather that such books can be completely unknown to the public without really being forgotten or lost at all. The contention made within works like the Admonitions of Kahat and Jubilees is that even seemingly lost books were actually known and preserved all along by a trustworthy line of Jewish scribes. 1 Enoch, in fact, goes even further, claiming that Jewish scribes have a special connection to heaven and actually have been taught by angels from books in heaven, reading from written tablets up in heaven. This claim is even more audaciously extended by Jubilees for Moses himself. Jubilees claims to be the very product of angelic dictation to Moses, recasting revelation from older prophetic models thus into imagined heavenly acts of scribal teaching. What the Torah treats as the precariousness of writing and what 2 Kings 22 treats as the problem of the lost book seem to have become thus, in the Second Temple period, a new space for literary creativity around the biblical past. And if the result is an image of books and writing that seems more akin to the perspective that Plato attributes to the Egyptian god Thoth, it's perhaps not coincidental. Not only did these new Jewish views about books and writing first take form when the land of Israel was under the rule of the Hellenistic Empire of the Ptolemies, centered in Egypt, but some Jews of the time who lived in Ptolemaic Egypt, such as Artabanus, euhemeristically made the claim that Egyptian myths about Thoth, whom the Greeks equated with Hermes, were really actually about Moses himself. Just as Jubilees credits Enoch with the very invention of writing, so Artabanus actually claims it was Moses who invented Egyptian hieroglyphics and taught the Egyptians how to write. If such claims might sound strange to us today, they do make much more sense when seen against the background of what we now know of late Second Temple Judaism as a spectacularly productive era for Jewish literary creativity. Even before the Dead Sea Scrolls, we could glimpse hints of this creativity in the many ancient Jewish writings that were preserved by Christians in or via Greek, in a rather startling array of different genres. Now, with the evidence of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can fill in this picture so as to include the literary creativity of Jews in Second Temple period who wrote in Hebrew, but also in Aramaic as well. And as we have seen, some of this literary creativity was reimagining the entire biblical past before as having been already this much filled and brimming with books and authors. Writing of memory and forgetting in ancient Israel in the Hebrew Bible, Mark Smith once suggested that once written memory passes into a body of text, the tradition does not seem to throw out what it forgets. Instead, it tends to rewrite what it doesn't remember. And I suggest we perhaps see something similar in late Second Temple Judaism as well. If the Torah itself, for instance, says quite little about figures like Amram or even Enoch, this very terseness seems to open a space for later literary production. What's striking, however, is how much of this literary production also reflects upon the problem of forgetting, precisely in relation to writing. The agency of scribes is not just recovered from forgetting. Rather, scribal communities are simultaneously recast in Second Temple times as those who actually preserve the ancestral wisdom of Israel's past against forgetting. This makes it all the more ironic, of course, that most of the Second Temple Jewish books that made these claims were themselves totally forgotten, at least in their Jewish reception in the wake of the Roman destruction of the Second Temple and the rise of the Rabbinic movement in late antiquity. Only a small sliver of the Jewish literature of the Second Temple period would be continuously preserved by late antique rabbis and their heirs. Of pre-rabbinic literary traditions of Jewish Aramaic in the Hellenistic age, all that is kept is mostly what remains within Daniel. Of the new Hellenistic era Second Temple traditions of novelistic prose, only Esther; of philosophy, only Kohelet; and of the literature that celebrates the power of the scribe, all that's left are stray pieces of the wisdom of Ben Sira, relegated to the outside books, but preserved partially nonetheless. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars did not quite have a sense of how much was lost, and accordingly it was presumed that early rabbis simply rejected all apocalypses, or perhaps all Jewish books written in Greek, or perhaps all those books embraced by Christians, in a sort of obvious selectivity that seems so self-evident as to require no explanation at all. With more evidence now, it's clear that the issue is a bit more complicated, but also, I'd suggest, much more interesting as well. My current book project maps a variety of related dynamics, the aggregation of which I suggest eventually resulted in the loss of much of the literary heritage of Second Temple Judaism to the Jewish tradition writ large. But for now, it suffices to note those dynamics that pertain specifically to books. From what we know of earlier Second Temple Jewish literature, for instance, we'd expect that an appeal to books and writing might loom large in the Jewish response to the catastrophic ruptures of the failure of the First Jewish Revolt and the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. And this, in fact, is precisely what we do see in 4 Ezra, a Jewish apocalypse written in the immediate wake of this destruction, possibly in Hebrew. There, the Roman destruction of the Second Temple is addressed through a parallel with the Babylonian destruction of the First Temple, as seen through the eyes of Ezra himself. The scribe Ezra laments that the Torah has been burned, but this is not a lament about the precarity of writing. Rather, it occasions the reassertion of the power of writing and the power of the scribe to mend any rupture through the production of new books that are also old books. At Ezra's request, according to 4 Ezra, God has re-revealed to him the entire library of Jewish ancestral literature, 24 public books, but also 70 secret books, which Ezra dictates and the 5 fastest of his scribal assistants accurately transcribe. As with Enoch and 1 Enoch and Moses in Jubilees, Ezra in 4 Ezra embodies the claim of the Jewish scribes' unique access to a heavenly library. And the reader is assured that as a result, no Jewish knowledge could ever really be lost. 4 Ezra has notable overlaps with later rabbinic tradition, as Michael Stone has shown, but nevertheless, it would not be preserved as part of the Jewish tradition. And perhaps more importantly, its very approach to addressing rupture is decisively what we do not find among those late antique rabbis who shaped Judaism as we now know it. The rabbinic movement took form after 70 CE in the Galilee, in particular around sages famous for reinterpreting the Torah for a new templeless age. Central to the articulation of the authority of the rabbinic sage, however, was a very different approach to the preservation of knowledge as well as teaching. Rabbinic compendia from the Mishnah to the Talmud to all varieties of midrashim are marked by the preservation, famously, of greatly diverse opinions and perspectives. What we don't find, however, are expressions about the bookish ideology that we now know to have marked so much of the earlier Jewish literature of Second Temple times. Rather, already in the Mishnah, redacted around 200 CE, we can glimpse the displacement of these earlier approaches by counterclaims about teaching and transmission that were decisively oral. The most famous example in the rabbinic case is the chain of transmission at the very beginning of Mishnah Avot. This chain of transmission begins with what Moses received at Mount Sinai and is transmitted forward in a line of oral teaching and transmission that leads to the Tanaim, that is, to the first generations of rabbinic sages in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, whose teachings are preserved in the Mishnah, Tosefta, Halakhic Midrashim, and marked as Braitot in the Talmud. Here, as in the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls, 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and 4 Ezra, what we do find is a claim of an unbroken succession in the transmission of Jewish knowledge, even across vast expanses of historical time, and even across moments of catastrophe. Here, too, a chain of transmission marks those placed at the end of the chain, moreover, as the true custodians of Israel's past in their present, while also recasting the past in their very image. But when we compare this claim to those before, what is striking is what and who is left out. Even prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars often noted the omission of priests, or rather their reduction to a single figure, the Seleucid-era high priest, Simon the Righteous. Read from a fuller sense of the Second Temple Judaism that flourished prior to the rise of the rabbis, however, what is striking is the absence of scribes and books. And what has not been noted, at least to my knowledge, is what else is omitted besides. That is, everybody prior to Moses. It's not just that scribes are left out of the chain of transmission in Mishnah Avot. So too with all of the pre-Sinaitic figures, from Enoch to Amram before Moses, who proved so central to the scribalized memory-making of Second Temple times. We have seen how much Second Temple Jewish literature defends and depends upon a scribalized past, which includes claims of a chain of transmission from Enoch to Levi to Moses to later priests and scribes as well, idealizing both literacy and libraries. But after 70 CE, in this key era for remaking Jewish memory and their articulation of distinctly rabbinic claims to Jewish authority, we find a reimagining of the biblical past as well, in which all this becomes erased, largely without a trace, relegated to forgetting by means of its almost total displacement. In effect, much of the pre-rabbinic Jewish literature we now know from the Dead Sea Scrolls seems to have become obviated. What we see here, in other words, is an example of the phenomenon that sociologist Eviatar Zerubbabel describes as the social partitioning of the past into a memorable history and a practically forgettable prehistory. Such partitioning, as Zerubbabel shows, delineates our mental reach into the past by setting certain historical horizons beyond which past events are basically relegated into irrelevance. As such, the act of defining a certain moment as the actual beginning of a particular historical narrative implicitly also defines for us everything that precedes it as mere prehistory, which we can practically forget. In the case of Avot, it's an erasure that we only notice now that we have more materials to show us just how much was written in the Second Temple period about the period prior to Moses. This is what finds an almost complete erasure in the reconfigured temporalities of rabbinic memory making, thus fostering the forgetting of those earlier Jewish texts and traditions that made these very claims, which need not have been suppressed or rejected in any active sense at all, to have thus faded into obsolescence after having been relegated to forgetfulness. But this partitioning of a pre-Sinaitic past before Moses as prehistory is only one part of the broader shift in rabbinic temporality and memory making. Here as elsewhere, the scope of the usable past shifts with a change in what is deemed useful about the past. Here too, the contours of remembered time become pruned to fit a new purpose. During the emergence of the rabbinic movement in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple, this purpose is largely juridical. That is, the rabbinic conversation with the past becomes shaped by different concerns that are far less historiographical than halachic. And it is this context that I'd suggest shapes the Jewish past as largely reconfigured around a twofold division of sources from which to derive juridical or halakhic rulings. That is, consequently bifurcated between biblical and rabbinic, Divra Torah and Divra Sofrim, D'Oraita and D'Rabbanan, with very little care for what comes before, but also for what comes between. And hence, it is perhaps not surprising that rabbinic tradition can come to de-emphasize the pre-Sinaitic past, but also to compress the Second Temple period, reducing 6 eventful centuries of Jewish intellectual life into a blur that's a very short bridge between Moses and the rabbis. A focus on writing, however, leads us to notice something else besides. What we find in the early rabbinic remaking of the memory of the Jewish past is not just the forgetting of this or that book. It's the articulation of a very different vision of what it means to remember. In place of the elevation of books and the articulation of Jewish knowledge on the model of a library, early rabbinic ideals of learning largely limit the power of textuality to the written Torah, while otherwise lionizing orality, including but not limited to the articulation of a new notion of oral Torah, centered in rabbinic halachot that are marked as knowledge that should not be textualized, or at least shouldn't be taught from texts. Even rabbinic exegetical claims concerning the written Torah, thus, are not claims about writing per se. What's idealized as expertise is not a scribal literacy in the sense we see in Second Temple times, but rather a sense of the ability to speak scripture from memory, without the need, ideally, to consult any physical book at all. Knowledge is embodied rather than textualized. And even if the rabbinic ideal of orality and memorized knowledge may be largely ideological, as Martin Jaffe has suggested, it's an ideology that matters, not just for the articulation of a distinctly rabbinic vision of expertise, but especially for the emphasis on practices of teaching, which would have rippling effects, I would add, on the reception of what we now know to have been an entire tradition of earlier Second Temple Jewish literature linked to other modes of teaching, more scribalized. If the Second Temple Jewish literature was increasingly forgotten, it was in part because books outside the Bible had no place, or little place, within rabbinic pedagogy, but also in part because bookishness also didn't have that much place either, rendered irrelevant by new forms of pedagogy and education, centered instead on memorization, repetition, and speech. In the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and 4 Ezra, as we have seen, the pedagogical practices of Jewish scribalism, scribal dictation, and scribal education are projected into the past, but also up into heaven, resulting in the remaking of the memory of Moses as most evident in Jubilees. Its image of Moses here in Jubilees is no less an image of the ideal of Jewish education, how to learn and how to teach, as closely linked to the ideal of transmission of tradition as well. Later, within rabbinic tradition, we also find the transmission of tradition modeled on practices of teaching that are projected back onto the time of Moses, such as in this famous passage from Tractate Erevim in the Babylonian Talmud. But here as elsewhere in rabbinic tradition, writing is nowhere to be found. The memory of Moses is remade in the image of a rabbinic sense of education that centers instead on memorization, repetition, and speech. What's on the page is less important than what's in the mouth. By the Middle Ages, the overriding of Second Temple Jewish scribalism in rabbinic memory making would actually be so complete that even the Second Temple period would be reimagined as an age of orality. The most striking and arguably influential example occurs in the famous letter written by Shirir Gaon in the 10th century. But here, even as he defends the rabbinic ideal of orality, we can glimpse yet another surprising twist in the shifting tensions in the Jewish tradition surrounding writing as well. Shirir Gaon here answers Karaite critiques of rabbinate appeals to oral Torah, and he thus holds firm to older rabbinic ideals about the oral transmission of rabbinic teachings as obviously the ideal. What this medieval Jewish author does not do, however, is simply repeat or extend a chain of oral transmission of the sort that we saw in Mishnah Avot. Rather, what Shirir claims for the Mishnah ironically falls closer to what we saw in 4 Ezra. Here, too, the claim is that an act of rewriting was necessitated by the destruction of a temple, so as to preserve knowledge from before the destruction of the temple, and here, too, the authenticity of the resultant book is vouchsafed by a tradent, but also by divine inspiration. The ideal is still orality, but when the problem is preservation against rupture, the medieval solution becomes, again, writing. For our purposes, what's important about this passage is that what's overwritten in the process is precisely the richness of the Jewish literary production in Second Temple times. Shirir Gaon's account of the textualization of the Mishnah is predicated on the claim that these exact same teachings already circulated before the destruction of the temple, albeit in purely oral forms. In the Middle Ages, the pre-rabbinic past becomes rewritten as a proto-rabbinic past, and writing as if it was not needed at all. It was only after the destruction of the temple, in fact, Sherira here claims, that teachings even needed to be written down to be remembered. And thus, in the process, the period we now know to have been marked by a renaissance of Jewish literary production is even further recast as if an idealized age of oral transmission. There's not even a smudge left of all the books written during this period. Shira Gaon writes as if there were never books at all, in fact, between the Bible and the Mishnah. By the 10th century, it does seem like much of the Jewish literature of Second Temple times had been effectively lost, or at least lost to those Jews who we know and remember because of their writings. Many Second Temple Jewish texts seem to have been so wholly forgotten until their recovery within modern manuscript finds like the Dead Sea Scrolls. But we do know of some other Jewish texts from this time because of their preservation of late antique and medieval Christian scribes in Greek, Syriac, Ethiopic, and other translations. And thus also scattered throughout Jewish history, we also find some moments here and there in which some Jews do unexpectedly re-encounter their own ancient books by virtue of surprising encounters with Christians, reminding them of a literary heritage that had been lost to Jews. Nachmanides in the 12th century, for instance, knows and quotes from the Wisdom of Solomon in Aramaic, seemingly from a Syriac version in the Peshitta. In the 16th century, Azaria de Rossi learned about the Epistle of Aristeas after an earthquake from a Christian neighbor, and he reads the Septuagint because of its Christian translation into Latin. Reminders of the forgetting of lost books could also inspire new Jewish literary creativity as well. The Christian reminder of the Jewish memory of the forgetting of the Book of Tobit, for instance, seems to have inspired the production of new Hebrew Tobit books in the Middle Ages. And so too with Yosipon, which reflects knowledges of Josephus's writings via Christians as transmitted by Christians, but also becomes its own literary composition, forged in the creativity of an early medieval moment of reminding about the forgetting of the Jewish historian Josephus. Likewise, we might glimpse hints of Jewish knowledge of parts of 1 Enoch and 3 Enoch, Sefer Hechalot, and hints of knowledge of Jubilees as well in Sefer Asaph HaRofeh. Here, too, we may glimpse part of what we miss, too, about Jewish cultural history when we dismiss or ignore forgetting as merely a failure of memory, rather than attending to its microdynamics and effects. The forgetting of books can result from creative cultural forces. And so, too, there's also cultural power in the moments where a forgetting comes to be noticed and remembered yet again, as we see from 2 Kings in antiquity to Yosipon in the Middle Ages to Azaria de Rossi in early modernity, and I would add, to ourselves with the Dead Sea Scrolls today. And thus such generative tensions of forgetting are even evinced in what might seem to be the ultimate technology of memory, namely writing. It's disembodying teaching from teachers. Writing can sometimes foster forgetfulness, as Plato already direly warned us. But this very forgetting can sometimes spark a nostalgia for what might have been, inspiring tradients to rewrite the past in the spaces of what had been forgotten. And so, too, with the forgetting of books, which can sometimes clear the way for reimagining the past anew, but sometimes lead from embodied memory back to bookishness again, which are easily lost, but then also sometimes found again, thus proving right both Plato and Herodotus, both Thoth and the King. Thank you.
So Professor Reed has agreed to take questions herself from the podium, and I will perhaps step in at the end to moderate. Maybe I can abuse my position as moderator
by all means.
To start us off. I was wondering if you might return us to this idea of the forgetting of the soul with which you began, Plato's notion of the soul, and ask what is the uniquely ancient Jewish or Jewish form of forgetting of the soul? Does it have to do with the forgetting of books specifically, or does it have to do possibly with how forgetting and remembering seem to be intertwined and dialogic, or other?
Actually, that's a good question. That's a question to which I've actually never, this is like why I love, that's why I'm so grateful. I've actually never thought about it in that way. I personally don't tend to look a lot at, I don't tend to make many sentences that have the word uniquely in them. But it is an interesting question, like, was there something distinctive? And I think in some ways the framing of your question might point to it, which is all of these examples I've given are not about individuals and souls, they're about communities. And so even, there's a sense in which it's all a ancestral, like the anxieties about forgetting are ancestral and collective. They're not individual within at least what we see in this period in Jewish tradition. So it's actually quite interesting. So the contestation is not about the individual. I think if maybe we might find in Philo, with regard to the description of like the Genesis 12, but I would have to look there to see if the language is there. But I think that if we had to look for it, it would probably be somewhere that was highly in conversation with kind of more philosophical questions. Whereas it's interesting here, it's like it always assumes that the unit of remembering and forgetting is the people. So thank you. That's very interesting. Yes.
Thank you so much, Annette. This was lovely. I found myself throughout your talk sort of delightfully and curiously smiling, given our conversations yesterday and today about a particular book, because we're looking to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it shows us these texts that we didn't know existed, and then points to, oh my God, there's so many others that we haven't found yet that we don't know exist. But when comparing the fragments to what we did know exist, such as what did get canonized within the Hebrew Bible, there's one text that is glaringly missing, which is Esther.
Yes.
And so I don't know if you have any.
Yeah.
I don't think we can be positivistic and say, like, this is why Esther is not found within the Dead Sea Scrolls, or this is why we haven't yet found it within some sort of cave in a nearby area. But I don't know, do you have any curiosity about that or thoughts about that? Where is Esther?
So we were just actually, Kate and I were just talking about this. I believe her answer, which is that it has to do with festal remembrance and the kind of the lunarness of it. Yeah. So much of you see it is actually within the Aramaic fragments of Juanina, well, except for maybe one of them, and the related Hebrew scientific materials within the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a real commitment to a very specific solar calendar. So it just doesn't fit. Yeah.
So it almost feels like the missingness of Esther and following that frame of thought pushes the idea that this is a very specific community putting these texts in the caves, as opposed to random gathering of texts in the midst of the Jewish-Roman War. Right?
I do tend to.
This very specific community doing this.
I do tend to think that we generally have some concept of an ancestral library. Like I follow Mladen Popovich on, he had a kind of very interesting, synthetic survey of those questions. But that means that, like a library, it includes a lot of things that would be important to everybody, but also has its specific things it keeps. I mean, you see that among the Ptolemies too. That you have this kind of case. There's certain fixations, but then there's also just like a bunch of other stuff. So that would at least be. This is it's an interesting question, but I think if I had to make a guess, that's what I would guess. And also because precisely of the there is a density of calendrical astronomy, which, it's like we're not finding it all over the place. I don't think it's like everybody's doing calendrical astronomy and it's, oh, look, it seems, it seems to be a specific interest. That would be my guess, but I don't know. You can talk to Kate, she knows better than I do. Sorry.
So,
good to see you.
Thank you so much for this really interesting talk. And I want to take the trace of your last comments about Nachmanides and and ask if you would want to speculate. There is an interesting debate in the Ages among Talmudists about whether or not to use manuscripts, Nachmanides very invested in manuscripts, versus Josephus and the Franco-Germans, who they imprecate those who use manuscripts and rather just use the accepted text. I'm wondering if you think that that's a continuation some of this, this dispute or debate?
I think so. I haven't. That's the kind of. I'm moving forward. You got me to the 10th century. I'm moving forward in time, and that's the kind of downside and the upside of presenting something in progress. In general, I don't focus that much on the Middle Ages, apart from the question of these moments that pertain to the Second Temple past. In part because they're actually for two reasons. One of which is there's a lot of it, and the other of which is because of the Cairo Geniza materials. I feel like some of it is, we're just going to wait it out. That so much is actually being uncovered in a sense that it's hard to know what people. But I do think, this is also partially why I'm leaning on a lot of the notion of, that what we see ideologically. And I think that example is a great example of what we see ideologically. Like that ideological tension is clearly kind of continues to play out. And I think, it's an interesting question of the degree to which, especially an ideology of oral transmission and memorization can take place in a world where you have texts, and then like how you take the ideology and fit that in. And I think it's probably, for the earlier materials, it's probably the opposite. You also have a lot of oral transmission. You're just putting the, but I think that example is a good example because it shows it's always about who. Like it says it's about what, but it's actually about like what does an authority look like?
And
claiming
a tradition back to North Africa.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Yeah. No, thank you.
Thanks so much for that talk. I'm curious, you presented the difference between, say, Second Temple perspective on access to and transmission of memory with the Rabbinic conception as like a chronological development. And it surely is that. I'm just curious, I think on Tuesday I remember you kind of noting that, for Ezra and the compiling of the Mishnah were not so far apart in time.
Yeah.
And to what extent do you think it might be possible that these views or visions are actually in competition or swirling at the same time, say, in the late Second Temple period?
That's a fantastic question. In my book so far, I put it at the end of the book as a question because I don't know how we can say it. I do think that we do have to. Part of thinking about issues of forgetting that I find interesting and challenging in a positive way is also to take seriously the way in which, as historians, our views of the past are partial. And I think this is a great example where you have like archival amnesia, meaning that which survives to us, can sometimes, the temptation to put it in a chain of, this came first, this came second, versus for this period we have the bulk of our materials preserved by X, for this period we have the bulk of materials preserved by Y. And it is entirely possible that that's what we're seeing. I think what's fascinating, though, is the fact that they're so proximate, and that at least in some moments, having that more material from the Second Temple period really sees like what are the choices that the rabbis aren't making. Whether or not others were making other choices at the time, nevertheless, it still sharpens our sense, whether it's synchronic or diachronic. But it's definitely that's definitely the challenge. If we see, I think part of like our narrowing becomes precise. The irony is that because of the textualization of the rabbinic tradition, that's why we see the entire late antiquity primarily through their eyes. So the irony is that this movement that lionizes orality is, looms so large for our ability to do history because they're in the textualized archive. So. So no, thanks. That's a great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the talk. I was I'm really curious about or interested in the idea of, I guess, the rediscovery of older, Second Temple period texts in the medieval period, in particular because if they're using like Christian preserved versions of the text, then it's not like they're just picking up the same text that the Second Temple, like all interpretation or all translation is interpretation, and so passing through time that. Like, it seems like they would then be picking up very Christianized versions of ancient texts. And so then, in discovering, the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that, that we can compare how medieval interpreters used Christian versions of these texts and how the texts actually existed in the Second Temple period. Are there ways where we can see like the development of Christian thought making its way into medieval Jewish interpreters or later? Or
That's a good question. I actually don't know.
Okay.
Especially the medieval examples. The medieval examples that I can think of where that might be true. I mean, I guess medieval. I can think of kind of an early medieval example is like it may be the sense that when in Byzantine Palestine you start to get a kind of resurgence of Enoch materials, that it's because of the circulation of excerpts. So Christian excerpts from, the Book of the Watchers and so forth, that don't get preserved in full. They're just like little pieces.
Right.
So it's like that selectivity. And it may be the case that that's partially what we're seeing. Jubilees also comes down selected. They're preserved in full in the Ethiopian church, but otherwise, in late antique and medieval Christianity, particularly in and around the land of Israel, they tend to be preserved in excerpts. So you do see the power of like what's chosen. And that's a good other example. It's not just a translation. And sometimes there's a translation, a back translation. And this is what I find. I'm like fascinated with Zaria de Rossi because he's like he's like, oh, now this is Latin. I can read it. It's just like a very funny, But there too, you have like a couple steps of translation. And it would be interesting to note, I wonder the degree to which, even as he's trying to bring that material back in line with rabbinic tradition, that's partially what's shaping it. But so, yes, I should that. So I'll keep an eye out. But it's definitely kind of the case of Nachmanides is like because of Syriac translations, people are like, oh, this is terrible Aramaic. So they just think it's like, this is a mess, but it seems somehow original. And unfortunately, I wish more people did work on the Tobit stuff, because I think that's another case. There's something, the medieval Tobit materials are rich. Also, people have been so fixated on trying to use the Geniza copies of Ben Sira in Hebrew to try to reconstruct the Hebrew background of what we have transmitted primarily in Greek and Syriac, that I think they're not really, that there's more to do to say, it's not necessarily the case that it's different enough that something has happened to that material. And some of it makes into liturgy. It has this like that. So there's a lot of interesting materials in that way. But that's a great question. And I actually kind of like part of what I like about this topic. It was a fun topic. That's why I do it. But is also the way it's like kind of it's like that on the metaphor of the individual is true too. It's like if you forget something, you remember it. If you remember it years later, you're a different person who's remembering it. Or somebody, a family member tells you something that's been processed through the life of that family member. So it's a way of really thinking in kind of a personal and dynamic way about transmission. But thank you very much. A great question. Yeah. Yes.
Again, thank you for just another wonderful lecture. I really look forward to the book. One of the things that's just struck me again about forgetting and people who got forgotten came into sharp focus when you were talking about 4th Ezra. And then contrasting that with Pirkei Avot, where Ezra is left out. And I'm just wondering if you might have further reflections on that in the continuance of rabbinic tradition. Where is Ezra? He's such a central figure in the book of Ezra in the transmission, and then 4th Ezra traditions. And is there a reason that Ezra gets seemingly intentionally forgotten?
This is a question that I don't know the answer to. I know that there's recently been, because he's also less present in the Dead Sea Scrolls than you'd think. There's a number of cases where you would expect him to be more places than he is. I know Charlotte Hempel has been working a bit on it. And as has, Clary Schiffman did something recently. But, so far I think people are mainly kind of surveying it, honestly. There are some Ezra traditions that do come up in like later rabbinic tradition, but you don't see him as the answer in the same way that it would seem obvious in the Second Temple period.
Is he a competitor with Moses? So does he have to be forgotten in order for Moses to be remembered in a sense?
I mean, he's eventually associated with seemingly the kind of the change of the script change.
Right.
And we do see that in rabbinic traditions about that. But that's also, it's like a demotion.
Right.
You know, it's like, that's so he does kind of get squeezed in a little, but he's not the person. So maybe, you know, so it may well be, you know, Moses is too important. There isn't, I think the other thing that happens that I think is a place to look, you know, and this is like, I mean, I've been kind of struggling with how to kind of think about this, because it is also this big question, is a notion of periodization with respect to the exile. So the idea that you have like this real Ezra as kind of as a figure of return is less important, because there is an emphasis on exilic rupture as being the rupture that matters. But that's just a guess. So I'll let you know. But I agree. It's like it's a real puzzle. It's a kind of a case. It's one of those things where it's interesting when it's one of the great things about going through this, you know, Second Temple material. It's like so much of it has concerns that make a lot of sense from earlier biblical material. You can weave that together, but as you look forward, you kind of notice differently what's not there, and I think that's one of them. This is like, why is he not there? Within Christian traditions, within post-70 Jewish traditions and Christian traditions, Ezra materials like grow. We get like 6th Ezra, you know? Like they just like keep going. So the idea that somehow this figure also doesn't, you know, it's an interesting question. Yeah. If you think of anything, then let me know. It is it's very puzzling. Okay.
I have really, truly wonderful, I took more notes here than I have in a really long time, so thank you so much for this. I have a question about what happens before the flood, like Adam. So Adam being, I think Adam ends up being more important to rabbinic tales than in the Second Temple period, mostly to talk about, I don't know, Gentiles and Jews. But how does Adam figure into this telling of the past and remembering? Yeah. And also forgetting. Yeah.
No, it's an interesting question. Michael Stone actually quite a while ago wrote this like great piece about kind of the different periods of time that were of interest to different periods of time. You know, and he's someone, because of his work in kind of Armenian traditions and also various apocryphal traditions, has done a lot of work on Adam and Eve traditions. And that's one of the cases also with the Adam and Eve traditions where it's like, before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was, we have all this new literature. You expected there to be a lot of it. There just isn't. So I mean, for me in the Second Temple context, it makes perfect sense, because when you're thinking about, you know, Hellenistic Near East, Berosus, the idea of like what happens with the flood is very important. And the question of the origins of humankind is actually less of a preoccupation. So the idea is especially like of, you know, questions of this primordial rupture and who has the knowledge from before it. Especially with the kind of this shared Hellenistic Egyptian, Hellenistic Babylonian, and, you know, Greek Jewish critiques of the Greeks for being so young. Like you guys are just like born yesterday, you know. But it's always like goes back. Like you don't even know about this flood that happened that everybody else knows about, and we all are kind of thinking about knowledge before. So I just think there's a sense in which, you know, it is a kind of, you know, in the first, I mean, for Ezra actually, you see it. That's some of the first marker you see it as a serious concern. Paul for Ezra. And then also within both rabbinic and early Christian traditions care about Adam. But it's actually fascinating that it's this kind of proto-historical time is more important.
Great. Well, if there are no further questions, I want to thank you so much for being our Etta and Milton Leve Scholar in Residence. And before we applaud, I just want to say that I think that this position was really created for a visitor like you, a dream visitor like you, and we thank you for sharing work in progress, being in conversation, and for educating us and teaching us, but also being so interested in commentary and feedback. So a pleasure spending the week with you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.